So thank you all for listening. I know after lunch, sometimes, we're all over the place, but I'm hoping that somehow I'll be able to wake you all from that it's coming. But so I would like to start off by making some connections here. Um, we have folks here from different divisions. And so I want to show you how some of what we do might relate to the areas that we work in. Folks in the policy, on the policy team, program administration office. What we do in the transaction division is essentially implement the policies that were laid out at the beginning of the program, essentially, which you will see through the RAD notice. But as part of that, there's also a back and forth, because as we implement the program, we find some areas that need improvement. And so we would generally bring this back to policy and they would look into it. And we continue to build the policy, and the program continues to change and move with time. We respond to what the industry wants. We respond to some of the things that we need to do to make sure that we're closing transactions that are acceptable back out there. The other thing I should point out is that the review process, and Robert alluded to the approval and RCC data page. For the most part, when you look at it, you think this is a data entry activity, but it's a bit more than that, right? You have a page that has a few drop-down buttons, you're selecting yes and no, but you also have places where you're explaining things, you're putting notes in there. You should be thinking about the fact that what you're doing here is providing justification as to why you think this is an approvable transaction. This transaction is going to end up either with John for approval through what we call a delegated approval, or it's going to go through committee for approval. And beyond that point as well, we also have people who interact with those documents. Once we go through approval and we issue the RCC, we pass it over to closing, as you heard earlier. So it goes back to Nicole and Tim. And we need to provide Nicole a transaction that is okay for them, it's okay for legal. So this is a rationale that every time you're sort of thinking about as you review the transaction, you're passing it on, it has to go to Tom, he issues the RCC, and then it passes over to the closing division. I should also indicate that as part of the review, it's very consultative, right? You will be interacting with the PIH field office. If it's PBRA, you would have asset management involved. If it's FHA, you have the production office involved. But the other aspect is also that you will be consulting other areas of the resource desk. You'll be going from one page to the other. So let's see if this is all I was going to say on the front end. So coming back to the system now, it's 60 days since we invited the PHA to submit, and so they've done in and submitted all these documents for us to review. So usually, again, I'm going to put on my TM hat. What I do is I scrub this page to make sure that all the documents required have been provided. As I go through the documents, I usually would notate. As a TM, I used to put my notes in there. I don't do that anymore, but you're welcome to put your notes in there as you go through the documents. If you open the conversion overview, and as you go through it, it says they have 58 units, but you sorry. So when you open the conversion overview, you want to ensure that what's been described in the conversion overview is practically what you had heard in the concept call. And this is the transaction that you're going to be reviewing the underwriting for. In this case, when you open it up, it says there are 52 units that will be converting. And this is for Fairlane from Eufaula, Alabama. You're confirming that information. You're looking at the ownership information to make sure that it ties into what ends up in the resource desk on the ownership page. You're also looking at what the intended closing requirement is in terms of timing. if you recall, when Anua was speaking, she had spoken about also asking the question about the timing for closing during the concept call. Keep going. So this is a section where the housing authority would provide you with a description. They provide you two things on that section. It's usually first the property description, and then you would also have a description of the transaction that they're looking to have approved. Again, you're looking at all that to make sure that the numbers all tie in. On this particular transaction, they have 217 units, of which they're doing what we call a partial conversion. They're taking a section of those 217 units, 52 in this case, which they're going to cleanly demarcate from the entire parcel and convert. In addition, they're also building, it's going to be new construction. So they will be building 4 units in addition to bring this to 56 units. So once you go back to the transaction law, one of the pages Onua had gone through, you will see your 52 units. And then in a certain section above there, you will see 4 units shown as affordable units. And so those are kinds of some of the checks you make as you go through this and you write up your memo. Scroll down some more, Robert. Let's see if there's anything else to speak to. They show you what the reasonable rents are, the utility allowance information, ownership information. So this is a very important part of the review process. We want to make sure essentially that the housing authority is maintaining sufficient control over the property. So you would generally see they have a ground lease. Sometimes they set up another entity which they have interest in for the ownership. They have control agreements. There are different forms of maintaining that control. Scroll down. So here, I think Robert had spoken earlier about some of the encumbrances that are on the property. I think maybe John mentioned that you may have a DOT, a deed of trust, or a DOC on it, which is a declaration of restrictive covenant. So the PHA would have to make sure that we start the process to make sure that these could be released from the property because new encumbrances will be put on the property. So here again, Onua had spoken a bit about looking at the debt. Here they're speaking to the transaction that we're looking at. They will have a conventional loan on here. There's a requirement that they must have a loan which has a fixed term and fixed payments. So you want to make sure that that is the case. We do not have any balloons before year 18. Those also translate into the memo where we would be making the entries and the arguments or justification I mentioned earlier. So here they do not have any existing debt. We would usually look to see if they have any debt from their public housing, like EPC, CFFB. Is it existing mixed finance deal or FFB? In this case, there is none, so there's nothing to highlight that particular section. So that's it on this particular form. So the next section essentially indicates, the PHA indicates what kind of conversion they're going to be pursuing, a PBRA or PBB. In this case, it's a PBB. And then the next slot within the grid has documents to describe the engagement with the residents. They would provide us with a summary of the meeting notes, the attendees, the questions asked, all that stuff. We do have we have a template now that allows us to capture this a bit better. But those are the participants. You see the signatures, and you would see.
I've seen that.
So that's the agenda. Then the next section has some of the extract from the e-tool. In this particular case, this is a LIHTC transaction, so it it didn't need to get a CNA report, and it's new construction as well. So I think what they did was they were just putting in something like,
Just did the tool.
right, they did just the e-tool for this as part of the review. Environmental. So we do have the authority to use grant funds here. So once the Part 58 is completed, once the responsible entity completes that, we usually would have the PHA submit that to the field office, and they would also review the authority to use grant funds and provide an approval. At that point, we consider it an approved Part 58.
It's important to remember here, PBVs are doing Part 58s, PVRAs are doing Part 50. So Part 58, responsible entity, you all as a transaction manager don't have a lot of input with that. You just pretty much are accepting what they come up with. When you're doing the Part 50, that's what we're going to do heroes. We're going to talk about that later this afternoon. But for the grant loan specialists, y'all are doing Part 50s. Okay, so you need to think about the Part 58. Okay, we're going to be doing Part 50s.
And with a few slight exceptions to that Part 58 requirement, we would sometimes go back and see if there are housing requirements that have not been addressed. We would check to see if it's a flood environment. You know, we just want to be double sure sort of. So that's the only exception to what Robert mentioned. So the next section is where the PHA provides the development budget, which essentially is filled out as well within the resource desk on the transaction log. We have a section that carries the operating pro forma, and then we also have the sources and uses in the same section. So I did mention the 4 units of affordable units. So it's shown right there. If you add that to the 52 units, that comes to 56. They're showing us that they also, so those are the, that's the revenue for the affordable apartments. Is there anything else? Scroll down. So when you're looking at the transaction log for the sources and uses, you would have different sources of funding. And most times, or we expect that the sources should be described within the resource, within the transaction log. The transaction log allows you to generate several documents from it. There's the financing template, which is like the term sheet. And then we also have the sources and uses and the pro forma. So you want to make sure that the loan sources are programmatically acceptable. Here we have the first loan for 2.6 million, interest rate of 6.25, which is fixed. Amortization period of 35, the loan term of 20 years. So that's fine. So this is the term sheet. As I mentioned, it captures all that information describing who the lender is for each of the sources and the amounts and the terms of the source of funding. And so this is the use side of the sources and uses. Essentially, it captures most of what goes into the cost for the e-tool, legal cost. We also capture the reserves at the bottom of the screen there. As you can see here, there is an initial deposit of 16,800, which the initial deposit, or the IDRR as we describe it, is used generally to curtail the deposit requirement. It's not required, but usually if the CNA calls for that, then we would expect that it should match. Otherwise, the requirement is for them to make annual deposits to the reserve, which we would call ADRR. So here, back to the financing plan grid, we capture information as well on the development team, who are going to be the partners in the transaction. What do we have open here? Is that the term sheet? Okay. So yes, so right. So I've spoken earlier about the financing template and the term sheet. So this is the backup where we would collect the commitment letters. If it has tax credits, you know, you want to look for the award letter or the allocations and all that. But you also always want to make sure that if the numbers have changed, you go back to the PHA to request for updates to them, and also make sure that the terms are still valid for the transaction going forward. Scroll down. So there's nothing to provide usually. Sometimes we would have the subsidy layering review performed by the syndicate, which we would accept that if it's done prior to us issuing the RCC. Otherwise, we would perform the subsidy layering review to make sure that we don't have too much funds going into the project. Here is the pilot opinion section. Also, we want to make sure that if there is no real estate tax, you want to verify, do they have a pilot? If there's an amount shown in there in the real estate line, well, you want to find, does it look reasonable? Is it a continuation of pilot? We want to get the legal opinion to say the pilot is going to continue. Sometimes we would have an exception where the project is exempt from paying taxes. And in those cases, usually you would see a 0 shown in the pro forma. So looking at what were you looking at, Robert?
There's a pilot
letter. Okay, so that's a sample pilot letter here, essentially indicating that it's a cooperation agreement that allows them to continue to pay a small amount as pilot. So the title report, generally, we don't look at those, but we want to make sure that the PHA has actually ordered that. It comes up earlier in the concept call where that question is asked. Have they pulled a title report? Sometimes they do searches. It's some preliminary title work they do to make sure that once they come to closing, they're not met with some surprises. Essentially, that's the reason we make them get it this early. So we're looking at the approval of the 5-year amendment plan, the significant amendment plan. If it's an MCW agency, they will also have an MCW amendment plan, which is the PHA essentially saying this is what we plan on doing, and they're adding RAD to that plan to indicate that they're going to be going RAD. It's required, and the field office will usually approve that as part of their review. So the estimate of public housing funds, this usually, it's a form that the PHA provides to indicate how much they have in both operating and capital funds, which they think should allow them to be able to convert the project to RAD. We would sometimes go into the LOCS system to make sure that what they have indicated they have in that initial year funding tool actually matches what's in the system. And believe it or not, some PHAs have put amounts there that they quite didn't have. But it's a different conversation altogether. So we've come pretty much to the end. We have a section here where PHAs would usually put extraneous materials. Sometimes they would put 3-year historical statements there. They would put maps there. The market study. But as we go through the approval data, I would indicate in some cases, once you collect information from the housing authority, sometimes you may have to tell them to come back and upload to the system because it's part of the historical records. Okay, so all that talking that I was doing earlier was to essentially have you meet this friend of mine. And I call this my friend because when we first started the RAD program, we essentially did our entries in a Word document. That's where our review was done. And the day this came out, I went down singing hallelujah. I felt really good about it. I mean, but coming back to some of the conversations we started off with, you can see we have 52 units up here. which is what we're converting out of the 217 units. And so once I see that, the first thing I think of is this a partial conversion? Because it's not the full 100% number of units. So that you would have actually confirmed at some point with the housing authority at concept call. But that question also comes up here. Is this a partial conversion? Yes. And so it is important. If it's a partial conversion, we want to also make sure it's cleanly severable. If it's not cleanly severable, we have to take it to committee. There are other criteria of what we need to do to make sure that we can, in fact, remove those units from that AMP. But why this section of the review is important is that the questions must be accurate, because usually when we start a review, we do not have the entire form open. So you must provide accurate responses to this first tier of the review. Once you put all the information in there and you hit save, it would open up the correct form for you. Normally, this is where it would end, and you would say update approval information, then it would open up the rest of the form. So if you do not do that, or if you do that and then you have to come back and change it, then you may find that Robert is going to be tasked with going in and cleaning up everything, and you may have to restart. So it's important that you take your time to answer those questions. When the time comes, answer them correctly so that you don't have to go through that trouble. Just move a bit to the right-hand side of the top there, Robert. We have sections also that flow into this form from other sections of the resource desk. We address also here the question about, is it new construction? And then you come to a section that speaks to relocation and tenant meetings. All that feeds from other areas, but there's also an opportunity usually for you to respond to them here. And so you would see that we have drop-down fields in each of those sections. They all look great now because this is a transaction that has already gone through the process and has closed. So we are not able to alter the data at this point. All right, Robert. So here, go back so I could speak to timing again. So the question again about timing, when does the PHA want to close? Do they have some closing deadlines, hard deadlines that they have to work with? It's a tax credit deal. You know, they have place in service dates that they have to meet. So they want to close by such and such a time. This is where we capture the information for Nicole's team so that when she receives it and she sees a 1 in there, she knows that this is a deal that requires some priority. It's not the PHA just liking to close, but there has to be a reason for them to want to close or need to close. And we just provide the reason in there as well. We get the first shot of answering questions about environmental right here. It asks you the question if it's a part 58 or part 50 that you're doing. You select that information right here. Does it require flood insurance? You would answer that question here as well. I had spoken earlier about housing requirements. It's asking, do they have any of these issues on there? Lead-based paint, asbestos, radon. This is where you would highlight that as well. Now, if you recall, when we looked at the conversion overview, which the PHA provides, I had spoken about there being the property description and also a transaction description. This is where you want to capture that information. Where is the project located? You know, who is the PHA? Sometimes we have different names as well. You have a PHA who has an AKA, you know, doing something else. We would usually want to capture that here as well. What's the transaction that they're doing? It's going to be live tech. It's going to be FHA. You want to describe that here. This is a good opening to your review because it tells a story. Some people write this last, where you do other sections of the deal, and then you look for summary sections of it and you describe up here as well. It's almost like writing an abstract to a paper that you're publishing, but that's essentially how you could think about it. So this particular transaction, as I mentioned earlier, has 52 units. being rebuilt. They're also going to be having demolition done. And they also have relocation greater than 12 months. So what that tells you is permanent relocation, URA, all those things kind of start popping in your head. So have they met the requirements here? Have they complied with the requirements here? So these items that I described, the demolition, the new construction, and the relocation greater than 12 months are items that trigger loan committee. And so the form also offers space for you to speak to these things. You provide explanations for what each of them are. So this doesn't end with me as your branch chief or with John. We're bringing this to a committee with people who think differently. And so we must convince them. Again, it comes back to my point of this being a form that you have to use to justify that you've looked at the risk of the transaction and you think it's an approvable transaction. Yeah, sure.
Committee.
What's a committee? Who is a committee?
Who is on the committee?
So it's recap, it's PIH.
Like specifically who? Not like what individuals?
You want to know the individuals who are there? So John is there, the branch chief, the CM. We also have individuals from PIH. I'm not going to go into names, but we have representation from PIH who would usually be there as well. We have Tom, we would have multifamily as well, and production.
And some red deals go before committee and some don't, correct?
Yes.
What
So,
determines?
so it's these triggers that I
Okay,
was just
got it.
describing here. These are just three of several triggers you could have.
Okay.
And I had mentioned earlier that we have transactions that are approved by John. We call those delegated approvals. And then we have transactions that go before the committee.
Right.
And
But you
those,
said they don't necessarily think like, but if it's him, he thinks like,
No, it's, you're presenting your argument of risk to a committee. Now, folks in PIH have a different, say, viewpoint, right? They're still putting in place existing public housing, right? They're building new public housing, they're approving those deals, right? And they have different subject matter expertise on multifamily asset management, on multifamily production. So you want to make sure everybody's on board with this contemplation, right? And this a deal that we're presenting to committee. So sometimes people may have specific concerns, right? And so you want to make sure our deal, whether it's relocation over a year, why are people moving 4 times? Yeah, right. People shouldn't move 4 times for relocation. Right? That's a good point. They're going to kind of poke and prod at the deal, make sure it makes sense. Maybe they're thinking something we don't think of.
and that is not to say they think differently. Maybe I've mentioned it loosely. We do have programmatic requirements, but people have different perceptions of risk. So if you have someone ask a question, say, why am I looking at this transaction and after year 10 it goes negative? We would need to provide an explanation for why after year 10 the reserve goes negative, that kind of thing. You have to be able to justify why you think it works, essentially.
Yeah, I would say, Cynthia, one of the things that's just come up recently, a good example of this thinking differently is public housing has gotten frustrated with a couple of developers across the country and the reliance on public housing authorities to use the same developers over and over again. And so they've taken the opportunity to committee to voice their displeasure with that and to try and affect change down the line. And I think that's an opportunity for the committee because the committee is made up of multidisciplinary. You've got multifamily, you've got PIH, so it's a place for them to voice their. And yet again, we have Reliant coming to the table to do another rent transaction, and someone will say that's not a great idea. So can we collectively think about changing that? Right. So it's a way for that to happen. I would say that it's a way for other people to know what's happening in complex RAD transactions and to make sure that that's being heard across the department.
So we would present it in front of the committee.
the transaction managers do. I don't know that there will be committee for comprehensive or leading edge transactions. Why not? Roger Shiga said no, so no, you're not gonna commit, so you're not gonna worry about it.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
you gotta put a memo, but everything will be delegated for you all. So, yeah, see what.
So think about the approval committee as opposed to assess additional risk on the project more than anything else. The idea is not to break your deal apart, but to look for ways to make sure that we put it together. So ownership. Again, this is one place that John is going to look at 4 times. He's not going to pass on without looking at it again. But it's important to make sure that we provide the proper responses here. What is the PHA doing? Are they going to, is the PHA going to hand off this property essentially aside because it has LIHTC? Will they use an entity to facilitate the LIHTC transaction? There's one of the very first questions we have at the top asks whether we would have whether the project will continue to be owned as is. And if you see here, it says no. The no generates additional questions at the bottom where we're looking to allow you assess the ownership information correctly. So again, it's one place you want to make sure that you respond to correctly. If it has a ground lease, you would speak to that. If there's a control agreement, you would also speak to that. Is the PHA transferring ownership to another entity? In this case, it's a no, but they will be creating an affiliate or a wholly owned entity to facilitate the tax credits. So that's the information there. And then you would provide a narrative as well to address the ownership structure as described by the PHA. Now, Robert had said this is what our programs are all about, and he's correct. We are trying to address a backlog of work that these properties need. So every transaction you take, you should be asking yourself the question, how much work can be done? But I think I always see it as the question, how much more work can be done? These PHAs look for ways to skin it so they don't have to spend more. So you have to be thinking a bit one step ahead because they told their folks to tone things down. They don't want to spend much money. But again, you would look at the IDRR, the ADRR to make sure they match what the e-tool provider reported. We also look at the rehab amount, and then we confirm the scope of work. So the PHA makes an entry of what the scope of work is, but we also have a section where we do an upload. We take that from the secure systems, from the CNA tool, and we upload into the system. It has an auto function where it pulls from the Excel file and populates the resource desk with it. So that section is all the way in the bottom where you perform that, and then it summarizes and brings it up here. If these two numbers do not match what the PHA entered and what you uploaded, then you have to work with the PHA to make sure that it's reconciled. Here we have questions about the scope of work. Is it sufficient? You're saying yes. So in a way, you're opining on the sufficiency of the rehab. Now, back to this broadband discussion from earlier. If you see here, we have 230,000 shown in that field. It's slightly cut out, but it's 230,000 there. So it's a new construction, so you would expect to have it there. You may have instances where you were doing just rehab on the property, and they'll tell you that we do have existing broadband, so you may find yourself with a zero there. That's the only exception I can conceive right now of. Otherwise, you should always have a number in there.
They're supposed to put in like what they originally paid for the broadband?
That's what I'd like to see.
Okay.
But there are exceptions to all
Okay,
that.
okay.
Substantial rehab and new construction, we need to see a number. in
Okay,
there.
got it.
I mean, that we
Regular.
really do want to see that.
Okay,
What is that evidenced by? It's existing.
There is no,
Bill.
whatever they say. It's an estimate, right? This is not something that we're auditing. We're just trying to get a feel. It's a required item. They addressed it. They brought it up, you know, they responded. That's what you're looking for. That's what I'm saying.
So again, here, we have other questions here with respect to the repairs. How much time we're providing the PHA to complete the work. And then we indicate what date we're showing as a deadline to have all the work completed. At that point, I would say you want to also capture a cogent description in here of what is being done. We're not having you go in and retag in all the 300 lines that showed up on your scope of work, but we're saying highlight some of the bigger items from your scope of work in this section, just to buttress the point that, you know, they're doing that much work. And then you would also provide how much work they're doing in terms of cost. If there's any critical repairs, you might also want to speak to that here. And the critical repairs are just items that are completed prior to the transaction closing. So we also have questions here on the relocation. Essentially, will some or all units be vacant during construction? Yes. And I think that question helps with the RAP payment. Somebody spoke earlier about the RAP payments, I think John, essentially indicating that the housing authority is able to get a fraction of sort of their rents to help them have some income during construction. So the timing of the relocation, they're asking if it's going to occur prior to RCC, and the answer here is no. We rarely allow any relocations prior to RCC. Otherwise, if it has to occur, then we would have to go to committee and consider that for approval.
Sorry,
Rent conversion commitment.
Commitment.
That's the evidence. The RCC is the evidence of approval of the transaction. So you all have the commitment, exactly.
So here we do an analysis of the sources and uses. You looking at it and speaking to the sufficiency as well. Is it reasonable? You're also answering the questions whether the project will be using construction loan. In this case, yes. When we were looking at the sources and uses earlier, in the bottom section of it, they also captured that information on the construction debt. So it's right here. It provides you the terms. And just to indicate to you, we have another column here and over there. This is when they do the submission. This is when we approve, and it moves over to closing. If there are any changes, those continue to get captured in those. As you see, Robert has it highlighted there.
Oh, is that the other federal fund? I don't see the like the LIHTC fund. Oh, I see.
So the tax credit equity, yeah.
And we don't care about like rate or like the investor rate or anything like that. It's just the final number. Okay.
Yeah. So again, we have spoken about the requirements to have a fixed interest rate on the term of the loan, and also make sure that if it is less than 4 years, it has to be less than 4 years and shouldn't have any balloon prior to year 18. So the answer is yes to both. So it meets the requirement, or it complies with the programmatic requirements. Is the property is subject to other existing debt? It's no. When we looked at the conversion overview, we had no check marks on this CFFP, OFFP, EPC debt, mixed finance, and all that. Here we would generally want to speak also to the secondary debt. The secondary debt is required to be structured as a cash flow note. So in this case, the PHA has accepted that they would through the financing templates, they indicated there that these would all be surplus cash notes. So we're saying yes there as well. And then we're providing an extract here with a summary of the loan sources or the sources of the transaction, the funding. All right.
Appreciate.
So here again, we're going to speak to the construction loan. Here you want to provide a bit more description about the debt. Let's see if there's anything specific there. One thing I noticed though, when I was looking at it, was that the contingency, the rehab contingency was at 5%. So, and I know Carly helped through this deal. Do you remember why they used 5%?
They got approval from the tax credit investor, 5%. So that was permissible by HUD.
Right.
With its new change. So, and new construction, we just see less retro business.
Yes.
That makes sense.
So we hear a little bit about the tax credit investor.
Yes, we do that little bit, yes.
What is it for rehab? 8%?
Usually around.
It's usually 10%.
Sometimes we're seeing a little higher rate, especially now because of.
Steve.
Question.
Sure.
When there's conventional financing, so not like FHA insured financing, we rely on the lender's underwriting to show that like the new contract amounts support, the debt service. We don't do a separate underwriting as the agency on that.
You look. So you review it, but you're not overly concerned. If you saw something, you would ask to be had explained.
So we
You
can
can look at it, but it's not a detailed underwriting per se.
So we just trust that like JP Morgan Chase or Wells Fargo isn't trying to,
Yeah, because think about it. So unlike an FHA insured loan on a RAD transaction using JP Morgan Chase, what's the risk to HUD if they're wrong?
well, it's a non-recourse debt only that's allowed, or are they able to take over as mortgagee possession?
And
For a loan?
again, what's HUD's risk there? I mean, even if they did, I mean, HUD controls the house contract, right? They're not controlling the property. So if they did, maybe it's a bad owner that needs to go out. Right? Right.
Also, it happens like maybe 8% of the time over the history of the 10-year program where it's just a conventional. If we don't see that, usually it's FHA, we
Yeah.
trust that, right? Where it's tax credits, a lot of tax credits. When you have these layered financing, there's a lot of eyes on it, so we're more delegated, right, in our underwriting. Conventional is so rare, so I feel like Robert's saying, there's some things we check on.
We'll only get more of this on Wednesday.
And
That's it. We'll do a case study. But at the end of the day, a lot of stuff you're thinking about what's HUD's risk here. Right?
Thanks, Sarah. So again, we have a section here to speak to the environmental. We just provided a bit of summary in there to describe the transaction when the Part 58 or Part 50 got approved. In this case, Part 58, essentially indicating that the authority to use the grant funds have been approved. And so that's cleared. If there are any things you want to highlight in this section, that's where you would put that information. So the operating pro forma essentially is looking at the rents or the subsidy against the expenses. And sometimes we would find that the expenses may be high or they're low. This is an underwriting review you would have to make. It's a judgment call you would have to make. And if you look at it and you're not satisfied with what you're seeing, you could always ask the housing authority to provide you with their 3-year historical so that you could make some sense of the numbers provided you. We also look at, I spoke to the pilot earlier. This is the area where you would document that. We're looking at the cash flow. We're reporting that, making sure that it stays at above 1.11 in this case because it's LIHTC. Otherwise, it should be 1.5. If it was a no debt transaction, it should be $12 per unit per month. So market study, we had a market study done for this transaction at the time when they applied for their tax credits. So that report naturally is provided, and we just have to make a determination, look at the conclusion in the report, in this case, indicating that there is need for that residential in that space.
Another question.
Sure.
Market study. What are some of the requirements for the market study? And would HUD be required to be named who the report is for essentially? Like, do we have any specific parameters around that?
Market studies are typically not done. They're done for tax credit transactions, and so we would want to see a copy of what they had, but no.
I don't care about how old it is or anything like that. Sort of.
It's done for that, but lights like that is approved. So we did go over the FHEO requirements earlier with Honor, and in this case, because it's new construction, we had a site neighborhood standards review completed by FHEO that was approved. We also have accessibility review for this one, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that also was approved. So we essentially report that here. And then there's also a relocation checklist. We used to call it TM relocation checklist because the TM approves that. We would also describe that in this section, essentially indicating that it was reviewed and approved. We speak to the relocation budget. We opine, essentially, is it sufficient? So that's pretty much it. PIH review, the two things that we're usually looking for PIH review is the DOT release and the non-dwelling units or asset review that they would have to complete. But importantly, we want to also indicate that we've had conversations with the field office or asset management if they're involved, and to speak to their comfort level with the transaction converting. So Onwa spoke a bit to the choice mobility requirement. So I'm not going to hit that anymore, I think. But this is the section where you would capture that information, where they're asking if the PHA has a voucher program and all that. And then we would come to the term of the HAP contract. We also would speak to whether they're requesting a DOT removal with the release with the transaction. So we have a yes there. We come to the section where you provide a quick summary saying you've reviewed the entire transaction and everything looks fine. If there are other things you may want to capture there. And then we have this section where you provide a summary for what you want to move over to the RCC. That's usually key to respond to the items that are highlighted in the RCC. And then all of what Robert is scrolling through now is a library of conditions. And what I want to impress here for most of you TNs who will be using this is that you should ensure that you try as much as possible to use the items provided in this library. And if you don't find one, then you can work with your branch chief to see if there is a need to put one there, which is different. And sometimes we may have to pass it back to our support here, Robert, if they deem one of those that we create another condition for in the system, we would do that whenever we do our changes to the system.
In other words, avoid using other as much as possible.
Yes. So these are just some of the conditions. Some of them are special conditions. In other cases, the field office just has necessary approvals they have to do. Those we just put them on. In some cases, we just notate things we want to make sure that they survive the RCC. That's what those do. This is the scope of work I make reference to. And I mentioned that it pulls from your Excel sheet and creates all of this list, which this number here, 12,354,000, matches at the top where we looked at it earlier on. And the same number matches in the transaction log here, the sources and uses for the construction and rehab amounts. Scroll back down. That's it? Oh, okay. Well,
2 minutes there.
and then after this, there is a button you can push to see what you have for your RCC, but that's eventually what goes over to the closing department division.
Send it to your branch chief for approval because all of the text gets cut off. There's limits and all of the boxes and you can't tell.
So Robert,
Limited.
yeah, so there are two
You'll spend a
things.
lot of time
Yeah,
trimming.
Type less.
so you want to, there is a link to open the approval memo. So you want to look at that because you might have this much typed, but just this much shows up. Then you have to go back and trim it down and summarize and summarize. Thank you all.
That's okay. Let us know how many books.
So we don't have the right resource test, but we have the approval memo. And the methodology of inputting the information or when you do your underwriting review, it's pretty much the same information. It's through the finances, sources and uses, serve, deposits, irrigation and engagement, the environmental portion. So we do have the approval memo and the methodology is exactly the same. The only difference is that it's rolled up into the approval memo for the income side. We don't have the issue of being cut off, cut out in the middle of your language of the right resource there, but essentially pretty much the same. We walk away with within the methodology we discussed here. Your
So the mission will be that long?
it could be.
Yes, that's the requirements
Yeah,
for on
yeah.
the previous. And we have there are preset conditions, like we don't have to come up with our own, like.
Oh, we don't have conditions like in the right resource test. But
We will eventually have that. Yeah, we'll eventually have that.
Oh,
That'll come. So one of the things I do want to stress in this whole conversation, because it applies to both the red team and the GRP team, is your all's function is ultimately compliance check and a broad underwriting overview. Because you're delegating in most cases, you're delegating that underwriting to somebody else for a tax credit transaction, 100%, as John illuminated. Multiple sources of funding, lots of people looking at it. Your job as a grant loan specialist and transaction manager is to make sure that the program compliance things and that it just passes the smell test, if you will. You're not digging deeply in to find out what the minutia of this one particular line item is. You're looking at generalities. You're looking to see, I've got 3 years operating pro forma. I see what you've done here. I've got your financial statements and you're within a band of what we're doing. You know, you're doing $30 million worth of work and we looked at the CNA and we're on board with the scope of work. Here's how you're gonna pay for it. And you've got the lenders still lined up to do it. They've looked at your cash flow and we're okay. Again, there are minimum program requirements. 1.1 debt service coverage, right? But if it's 1.11 or 1.12, you're not gonna drill into why it's 1.1 or 1.2.
Stay under the weed.
I'm sorry,
Stay under the weed.
Weeds.
the other weeks. Exactly.
Just, so we were talking earlier, talking about title, right?
Uh-huh.
On these, we asked to see, any existing financing and things like that. But if we don't get like an actual title policy, like even a pro forma title policy at that point to review, how can we be certain that there is no other?
You're gonna get a title policy at closing, 100%. And again, we haven't gotten to closing now. All we've done is approve the transaction.
Okay.
Right? So we issued the RCC and then there's a whole mass of closing happening.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to see if there was like, if we tried earlier to,
Well, what we tried earlier is to try to get the title reports in, or that's one of the reasons the titles were there. From a transaction division, and from this day of training that we've been doing today, the grant loan specialists will learn this, the transaction managers will not. They do not know what a title policy looks like. Grant loan specialists will learn to be familiar with it, but the attorneys are looking at that for sure, right? I mean, that's gonna be a grant loan specialist function, for sure.